Nobody at Riverside Plantation could understand why she smiled that way. While other enslaved people showed fear, exhaustion, or hopeless resignation in their eyes, Sarah Johnson carried something different, a mysterious, almost peaceful smile that seemed to know something nobody else did. The truth behind that enigmatic expression would only surface 4 decades later, when forgotten documents revealed the most patient and devastating revenge ever recorded in the American South. Hello, my dear friends. I'm so glad you're here with me today. I want to share with you a story that touched me deeply when I first learned about it, the story of Sarah Johnson, an enslaved woman who lived in Virginia during the 1840s. This is a tale of secrets, patience, and a truth so shocking that it remained hidden for 40 years. I really hope this story moves you as much as it moved me when I researched it. Now, before we begin, I need to be completely transparent with you. This story is not 100% real in the sense that Sarah Johnson and the specific characters you'll hear about are fictional names and personas. However, and this is crucial to understand, every single event, every practice, every situation you're about to hear was a common documented occurrence during the American slavery era. These weren't isolated incidents, they were patterns of behavior recorded extensively in plantation journals, slave narratives, court records, and historical testimonies from the period. Historians have documented these practices in archives across the southern states, so while these particular individuals may not have existed with these exact names, what happened to them happened to countless real people during this dark chapter of American history. The characters are invented, but the truth of their experiences is not. Now let's go back to the spring of 1843, in Southampton County, Virginia, where our story truly begins. The Woman Who Smiled. Riverside Plantation stretched across 3,000 acres of prime Virginia soil, growing tobacco and cotton under the iron rule of Master Charles Worthington III. The big house stood magnificent on a hill, its white columns gleaming in the southern sun, while down in the quarters, nearly 200 enslaved people lived in conditions that contradicted everything that mansion represented. Among them was Sarah Johnson, a woman of about 25 years, with dark, intelligent eyes and hands calloused from years of labor. She worked in the big house as a chambermaid, one of the few enslaved people allowed inside the master's private quarters. And that's where the mystery began. The other house servants noticed it first. While they moved through their duties with the careful blankness that survival required, Sarah seemed different. She would pause sometimes while making beds or dusting furniture, and a small knowing smile would cross her face. Not a smile of happiness exactly, but something else. Something that suggested she possessed knowledge that nobody else had. "What you smiling about, Sarah?" Martha, the cook, asked her one humid afternoon in July 1843. "Ain't nothing to smile about in this place." Sarah just shook her head gently. "Just thinking, Martha. Just thinking about time and how it changes things." This part of the story particularly struck me when I researched it, how she seemed to carry this secret knowledge like a precious stone hidden in her pocket, never revealing it, never letting it slip, just holding it close and smiling that mysterious smile. The master's secret. What nobody knew, what nobody could have known, was that Sarah Johnson had discovered something that would change everything. It happened on a cold February night in 1843, when Master Worthington thought everyone in the big house was asleep. Sarah had been called to the master's study late that evening. He was drunk, as he often was, and he wanted company. This was not unusual. What was unusual was what happened after. Master Worthington, in his drunken state, began talking, really talking. And Sarah, who had learned long ago to become invisible when necessary, listened to every single word. "You know what nobody knows, Sarah?" he slurred, pouring himself another whiskey. "Nobody knows the truth about this plantation. About my father's will." Sarah kept her eyes down, folding linens as if she wasn't paying attention. But she was. Oh, she was listening to every syllable. The old man, he felt guilty. Can you imagine? Guilty about slavery. So he made a provision, a secret provision in his will. What Master Worthington revealed that night, thinking Sarah was just another piece of furniture in the room, was extraordinary. His father, Charles Worthington Jr., had indeed felt remorse in his final years. The elder Worthington had written a secret codicil to his will in 1835, stating that after his son's death, the plantation and all its assets would be divided equally among the enslaved people who had served the family for more than 20 years. But there was a condition. The codicil would only take effect if it remained secret until the master's death. If anyone discovered it and spoke of it publicly, the provision would be void. The old man's lawyer, a man named Edmund Crawford, who had since passed away, had hidden the document in a secure location with instructions that it only be revealed after Charles Worthington III's death. "Nobody will ever know," the master laughed. "Crawford's dead. The document is hidden somewhere in his old office in Richmond, and I'm going to live another 40 years at least. This plantation will go to my legitimate children, and those slaves will die in bondage, just as they should." Sarah said nothing. Her face remained neutral, but inside something shifted. She had just been handed the most powerful weapon an enslaved person could possess: information and time. The long game. From that night forward, Sarah Johnson began to plan. But her plan was unlike anything you might imagine. She didn't plan escape. She didn't plan rebellion. She planned something far more patient, far more devastating. She began to smile. That smile became her trademark over the following months and years. People asked her about it constantly. The overseer noticed it and found it unsettling. Other enslaved people wondered if she'd lost her mind. But Sarah never explained. She just smiled and worked and waited. "That Sarah's got something wrong with her," the overseer told Master Worthington one day in 1845. "She smiles at the strangest times, like she knows something we don't." "She's just simple-minded," the master replied, not remembering their conversation from 2 years earlier. "Pay her no mind." But Sarah's mind was anything but simple. She was calculating. She realized that if she could survive, if she could ensure that other long-serving enslaved people survived, they would inherit everything. But more importantly, she realized that she needed to make certain that codicil could be found when the time came. Over the next several years, Sarah began a careful, methodical campaign. She learned to read, secretly, taught by an elderly enslaved man named Joshua, who had been educated before being sold south. She memorized everything the master had said that drunken night. She began asking careful, innocent questions to the master's new lawyer whenever he visited, pretending simple curiosity about where important papers go when lawyers die. Through these conversations, conducted over years with the patience of someone playing a game only she understood, Sarah learned that Edmund Crawford's old law office had been taken over by his nephew, and that the nephew had stored all of Crawford's old documents in a warehouse in Richmond. The waiting years. The 1850s passed. The master married a cold, sharp-tongued woman named Elizabeth, who treated the house slaves with particular cruelty. They had 3 children. The plantation prospered. And Sarah smiled. When I researched this period, I couldn't help but wonder what it must have been like, carrying that secret year after year, watching the master live his life, watching him profit from the labor of people who would one day own everything he thought was his. The psychological strength that required is almost incomprehensible. Other enslaved people came and went. Some died. Some were sold away. But Sarah made note of everyone who had been there since before 1835, the year of the old master's secret codicil. She memorized names. She kept track in her head, never writing anything down, never giving any indication of what she knew. "Why don't you ever look sad, Sarah?" a young house slave named Lily asked her in 1857. "Even when Mistress Elizabeth beats you, you just smile afterward. How do you do that?" Sarah looked at the girl with those knowing eyes. "Because I know something, child. I know that everything changes. Everything. You just have to be patient enough to see it." The Civil War came in 1861. The plantation struggled. Enslaved people began to escape to Union lines. Master Worthington grew older, harder, more bitter. His hair turned gray. His hands began to shake. And through it all, Sarah remained at the big house, smiling her mysterious smile. The master's death. Charles Worthington III died on a cold morning in November 1883. He was 72 years old. He died believing that his plantation, his fortune and his legacy would pass to his 3 children just as he had planned. The funeral was held on a grey Thursday. The entire county attended. Sarah Johnson, now 65 years old, stood in the back with the other former slaves. They were technically free since 1865, but most had nowhere else to go and worked the same land for wages barely better than slavery. And as the master was lowered into the ground, Sarah Johnson smiled. "Why are you smiling at a funeral?" hissed one of the younger workers. "Have you no respect?" "Oh, I have respect," Sarah replied quietly. "I'm respecting a promise made 48 years ago." The revelation. 3 days after the funeral, a lawyer from Richmond arrived at Riverside Plantation. His name was Thomas Crawford, nephew of the late Edmund Crawford. He was an old man himself now, and he carried with him a locked metal box. The Worthington children gathered in the study, expecting to hear the reading of their father's will. What they heard instead changed everything. "I have here," Thomas Crawford announced, "a document prepared by your grandfather, Charles Worthington, Jr., in the year 1835. It is a codicil to his will with very specific instructions." He opened the metal box and withdrew a yellow document sealed with wax. This codicil states that upon the death of Charles Worthington III, the entirety of Riverside Plantation, all 3,000 acres, all buildings, all assets and accounts, are to be divided equally among those formerly enslaved people who served this family for more than 20 years. The room exploded. Elizabeth Worthington screamed. The children jumped to their feet, shouting that it couldn't be legal, that it had to be a forgery. But Thomas Crawford was prepared. He had documentation. He had his uncle's notes. He had the original will with its secret clause. And most importantly, he had the law on his side. The document was legal, properly witnessed and unambiguous. "You're saying," the eldest Worthington son said slowly, his face pale, "that the slaves inherit everything?" "The formerly enslaved people, yes," Crawford corrected. "Those who have served this family since before 1835 and are still living. There were 12 of them, 12 people who had survived nearly 50 years of slavery and were now suddenly landowners. And among them, smiling that smile everyone had wondered about for 40 years, was Sarah Johnson. The truth emerges. It was Sarah who finally explained. At the first meeting of the new landowners, held in the very study where she had overheard the master's confession 40 years earlier, she told them everything. "I knew," she said simply. "I've known since 1843. Master Worthington told me when he was drunk. He thought I was too ignorant to understand or too powerless to do anything about it. He was wrong on both counts." The room was silent as she continued. "I couldn't tell anyone. The secret had to remain hidden, or it would be void. So I waited. I smiled because I knew. I smiled because I knew that every day the master lived in his big house, thinking he was secure. Thinking his children would inherit, he was actually just waiting out time until justice came. I smiled because I knew that patience would win." One of the other newly freed landowners, an old man named Samuel, stared at her in amazement. "You carried that secret for 40 years, never told a soul." "Not a soul," Sarah confirmed, "because telling would have destroyed everything. Silence was the only weapon I had, so I used it." The aftermath. The Worthington family tried to fight the will in court. They spent their remaining money on lawyers. They argued that the codicil was made under duress, that the old master had been senile, that formerly enslaved people couldn't legally inherit property. But the law was clear, and Thomas Crawford was an excellent lawyer. In 1884, the court ruled in favor of the 12 inheritors. Riverside Plantation was officially divided among them. Sarah Johnson received her portion, 250 acres of prime farmland and a share of the plantation's remaining assets. She was 66 years old. The Worthington children left Virginia in disgrace. Elizabeth Worthington died penniless in 1887. The family name, once so proud, disappeared from county records. But Sarah and the 11 others thrived. They sold some of the land, kept some to farm, and created a small community of black landowners that persisted for generations. Sarah herself lived until 1902, dying at the age of 84 in a house she built on her own land. And according to those who knew her, she smiled until the very end. Reflection and truth. My friends, I want to take a moment to talk about what this story means and why it's important. This narrative is fictionalized. Sarah Johnson, Charles Worthington, and the specific individuals I've described are not real historical figures with these exact names and circumstances. However, I cannot stress enough that every element of this story, the secret wills, the patient waiting, the eventual inheritance, the legal battles, these were all things that actually occurred during and after the slavery era in America. There are documented cases of enslavers who felt guilt and made provisions in their wills for the people they enslaved. There are records of secret codicils, of legal battles after emancipation, of formerly enslaved people who did inherit land and property. The practice of enslavers using enslaved women for their own purposes and then confiding in them, treating them as invisible, is extensively documented in slave narratives and historical records. What makes this fictionalized story important is that it represents a truth that happened to real people. The patience required to survive slavery, the intelligence and strength needed to play the long game when you had no power, the sweet justice of seeing oppressors lose everything. These were real experiences. Historians have documented numerous cases in Virginia, South Carolina, Georgia, and other southern states where provisions in wills led to formerly enslaved people receiving property. The legal system often fought against these inheritances, but not always unsuccessfully. Archives in Richmond, Charleston, and New Orleans contain records of these cases. This story is also important because it reminds us that enslaved people were not passive victims. They were strategic, intelligent, patient, and when given even the smallest opportunity, they seized it. Sarah Johnson, though fictional, represents thousands of real people who survived through wit, patience, and an unshakable belief that justice, though delayed, would eventually come. The smile in this story is symbolic. It represents hope carried in silence, knowledge held like a weapon, and the kind of patience that only those who have suffered greatly can truly understand. So while I've told you a fictionalized account, I've told you truth. The truth of what it meant to be enslaved, the truth of how people survived, and the truth that sometimes, even in the darkest circumstances, the oppressed find ways to triumph. Now, I want to hear from you, my friends. What did you think of Sarah's story? Could you have waited 40 years carrying that secret? What would you have done in her place? And please, I'm so curious to know, from which city or state are you watching this video? Are you in Virginia, where this story took place? Somewhere else in the United States? Or perhaps you're watching from another country entirely? Share with me in the comments below. I love knowing where you all are joining me from. If this story moved you, please leave your like on this video. And if you have family stories from the slavery era or the period after emancipation, if you've heard accounts passed down through generations about patience, survival, and justice, please share them in the comments. These stories deserve to be remembered and told. Thank you so much for being here with me today, for listening to this story, and for being part of this community, where we remember and honor those who came before us. Sending you all a big hug, wherever you are in the world. Until next time, take care of yourselves and each other.